Why does the Fed have a 2% inflation target? Why do other central banks around the world have similar targets? What is the origin of this particular targeting system? We're talking with Don Brash, who was the former governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the first central bank in the world to have implemented such a policy. We'll be talking about the origins of this particular policy. Don Brash was the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand from 1988 to 2002. He was a leader of the National Party and leader of the official opposition in the New Zealand Parliament. And he also served as an advisor to the World Bank, including 2 years working directly with the bank's president, Robert McNamara. He's also the author of Incredible Luck, a book written in 2014. Welcome to the show, Don.
Thank you very much.
But let's talk about monetary policy. Like I said in the introduction, you presided over the Reserve Bank of New Zealand when it adopted an inflation targeting of, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, 0 to 2% at the time in the late 1980s. And again, this was the first central bank in the world to adopt an inflation target. Prior to that, there were several other different targets that or systems that other central banks use, and we can talk about that. But this was the first of its kind in the world. Why? Why did New Zealand adopt a 0 to 2% target in 1989?
I think the answer relates to the fact that the government of the day wanted a different relationship between the government and central bank than had ever been tried elsewhere in the world. Prior to 1989, when the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act that year was passed, there were two kinds of central banks in the world. They were the banks like the Federal Reserve Bank, the Swiss National Bank, the Bundesbank, completely independent of political direction, at least in theory. And on the other hand, there were the central banks, which really simply the agent of the Minister of Finance, agent of the government. And they did whatever the government required them to do. And the consequence of that framework was that politicians frequently used monetary policy to short-term political advantage. Now, the 1984 to 1990 Labour government, which was in theory a left-of-centre government, but actually in many respects the most right-wing government economically that any New Zealand that New Zealand's ever seen, said, look, that's not the right framework. The government should decide what inflation rate they want. It's an inherently political decision. How fast do we want our currency to devalue? But to say that, they have to specify that, and in public, so the public knows what the government's inflation intentions are. And it almost requires a numerical target. Once you say the government should decide the inflation rate, central bank should be responsible for delivering the inflation rate, that requires some kind of specification of that target. And in our case, the target nominated by the Minister of Finance at the time was 0 to 2. We'd had a record in the 70s and early 80s of quite high inflation, not Zimbabwe or not Argentina, but nevertheless inflation in double digits through the 70s and early 80s. And the new government was determined to change that. They gave the central bank complete discretion from about 84 on to say, fix the inflation rate, get it down to low levels. When it finally dropped into single digits, the media celebrated. Hey, we're under 10%. That's great. And the Minister of Finance said, no, I'm not satisfied with under 10%. I want no inflation, like zero to 2. And that chance comment on television by the Minister of Finance was suddenly elevated to the target which the central bank had to deliver. When the law was changed in 1989 to make it clear that the government specified the inflation rate, the central bank was responsible for delivering that announced inflation rate, we had an inflation target. Now, the inflation target, as you said earlier, has been copied, or an inflation target has been copied by almost every central bank. Certainly every central bank in the developed world now has an explicit inflation target. What is not so common is the framework where the government nominates that target and makes the central bank responsible for delivering it. And that was copied by Australia, by Canada, by the UK, by Sweden, I think possibly by Israel. I'm not sure about that now. But certainly 4 or 5 countries in the Anglosphere copied, and Sweden copied that relationship between central bank and government. which I think is a very good one. It puts the imposition on the government to be accountable for the inflation rate, but for the central bank to deliver that inflation rate.
Okay, just to clarify, before this law changed in 1989, was the mandate of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand were one of the mandates to control inflation, or did that mandate change following 1989?
I think before 1989, the law was very vague, as in many other countries. Monetary policy was charged with keeping inflation under control, keeping employment up, looking at balance of payments equilibrium, etc. And of course, we've long since learned that you can't deliver more than one objective with a single policy instrument. And most central banks, therefore, have confined their target to either inflation or inflation qualified by employment. Now, I prefer a single target, but the employment target is often consistent with the inflation target, so it's not so difficult in most cases.
Okay, so let's talk about that. The Fed has two mandates,
Yeah,
as you know, employment and
yeah, and I
inflation.
think
You
they
don't
should not have. I think they should not have, because
okay.
one of the fundamental principles of economics, I think it was Haberler, who originally said, if you have two objectives, you need two separate instruments. Monetary policy is a single instrument. You cannot deliver two objectives with one instrument. Now, we fudge that. The US fudges that. New Zealand fudged it for 6 years. We had a dual mandate for a short period recently when we had a left-wing government in power. They said, deliver price stability and maximum sustainable employment. Now, wording it that way means you can accommodate those two objectives in a general sort of way. And the chances are the two targets are broadly consistent most of the time. In other words, if you have inflation which is very low, chances are quite high that you have unemployment which is undesirably high. And both objectives require some easing of monetary policy. Conversely, of course, if you have inflation too high, unemployment very low, both objectives require monetary policy to be changed in the same direction.
I see. Now, going back to what happened there in 1989, did you feel that your independence as central bank governor was challenged when the finance minister, I guess, instructed the central bank to start working on lowering inflation?
Well, of course, absolutely. I mean, the New Zealand Central Bank is not independent in a Fed sense or in a Bundesbank sense. It never has been. But I think that the framework is constitutionally right. It should not be bureaucrats at the central bank or anywhere else deciding what the inflation rate should be. That should be a political decision, and the politicians must, by law, disclose what that target is. It's the mischief arises because politicians say we believe in price stability, but crank up monetary policy so they win the next election. That's the mischief.
So how did the number of 2% arrive?
Well, it was not initially two, it was 0 to 2.
Right.
Like, quote, price stability was the minister's comment. And we rationalized it by saying there's a bias in the measurement of the consumer price index. I think it was a Boskin committee in the United States, wasn't it? It's a Boskin Senate committee, which estimated that the bias in the US was about 1%. So that genuine price stability is actually equal to 1% of measured inflation. So we said, if there's some bias, we don't know what price stability exactly is, but it's somewhere between 0 and 2, hence the target of 0 to 2. Now, subsequently, the target in New Zealand was widened slightly, initially to 0 to 3, on the grounds that in a small economy, individual price shocks are constantly pushing around that target. So a slightly wider target was desirable, and eventually the general feeling was, well, look, if we got near 0, we'd be easing up pretty aggressively anyway. So the target was modified to 1 to 3, and most central banks have a 1 to 3 target. Some have a which is of course midpoint of 2. So the 2% evolved from the original 0 to 2, in our case, then 1 to 3, 0 to 3, and then 1 to 3.
Do you believe the inflation target should be a fixed range, or do you believe that it should be, I guess, flexible or changing depending on what the equilibrium rate is? And of course, we know that depends on economic state, the state of the economy.
Well, my judgment is that picking a number makes good sense because the economy will then adjust to that number. Do you believe that price stability is on balance best for long-term sustainable growth? And our answer is that is yes. What's the best measure of that? We think about measured inflation of about 2.
So I'm curious to what extent New Zealand influenced other central bank policies around the world directly. When you implemented this change, you mentioned that the inflation rate did come down. So I guess this policy was, by historical measurements, successful. Were you contacted directly by other central bank governors about this policy, about how to implement it, why, so on and so forth?
There were a number of countries which quite closely contacted us on this. I guess most closely the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Bank of Canada, Bank of England. In fact, the Bank of England was interesting. They adopted our framework pretty well exactly after the 1997 election of the Labor government. And that adoption of our framework occurred after a very explicit discussion between me and one of Gordon Brown's key advisors at that time. So I think we did have an influence, at least on those English-speaking central banks, because the odd thing was about the United States and the Fed adopted an inflation target long before Alan Greenspan was willing to acknowledge that they had one, which for reasons I don't understand at all. I mean, inflation target, some of the benefit of it is it conditions expectations and conditions behavior. Therefore, hiding it under the bushel is an odd thing to do.
Well, I believe in the US, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but 2012 was the year when they officially had a stated number of 2%. So prior to that, it was not explicitly stated, correct?
That's my understanding. But my understanding also is that they actually did adopt an inflation target around 1996, 97, but Alan Greenspan was very keen, for some reason I don't understand, that it not be made public.
How did you feel about Paul Volcker, for example, who instead of having an inflation target, targeted the money supply? So as you know, he was a Federal Reserve governor from 1979 to 1989. He reigned during a period of very high inflation in the US. He was credited for lowering that inflation rate from double digits to single digits by also raising the Fed funds rate to double digits. And in fact, he was targeting a certain growth of the money supply, not so much the inflation rate, but ultimately achieved the same result. How do you feel about that policy?
Well, it's a question of how you achieve a target. I mean, most people don't care what money supply is doing. They care about inflation. So controlling the money supply is a means of getting to an inflation objective. Now, clearly saw controlling money supply as the best way of achieving that objective, but it wasn't an end in itself.
Before New Zealand introduced a 0 to 2% target, what did other central banks around the world do in terms of their mandates? Were there clear mandates around the world for other central banks, or did that slowly start to shift as well following the introduction in 1982, 1989 rather?
To the best of my knowledge, no other central bank had an explicit inflation target. I don't know of any other which did have. Uh, I think we were in that sense the first.
No doubt journalists asked you that when the inflation rate in New Zealand eventually fell down from 9% to much lower to about 2%, how much of the policy of the Bank of New Zealand played a role in lowering that, or were there other exogenous factors in the economy that were equally at play?
There were certainly other factors at play. For example, New Zealand had been an economy which had been highly protected against imports, import controls, quantitative import controls, high tariffs, etc. The quantitative import controls were largely scrapped during that 80 period. The tariffs were not eliminated, but were quite significantly reduced. Fiscal policy was tightened to some degree. So monetary policy was playing in a field where other actors were also involved. But it was clearly a quite an important factor. We had policy very tight, interest rates were very high.
Do you know why other central banks today picked 2%? Why not 0%? Some people have asked me, why not just target a steady state of no price increase? Wouldn't that be better for living standards?
Well, as I say, there is some measurement bias in CPI calculation. And the Boston Committee, as I said earlier, estimates that bias is about 1% annually. Um, and I don't know quite, I wouldn't want to rationalize two as against one. We originally had a midpoint of one, as I say, our target was 0 to 2, and it gradually morphed. And for better or worse, I think a lot of other central banks copied us. I mean, I recall who was the deputy chairman of the Fed, who's now at Princeton. His name momentarily escapes me. Uh, he was regarded as a dove. I recall talking to him about this target once, and he thought if we'd had it all over again, it might have been better if the target had been a bit higher. But changing it now would have some significant drawbacks.
One of the criticisms of an inflation target, at least for the US, is that the Fed is using the CPI as a target, a measurement that some economists believe is lagging and perhaps not flexible in adjusting for real-time price changes. And so their policy is also lagging. What's your response to this?
Well, yes, there's no doubt about that the CPI is not adjusted in real time. It does therefore have some lags built in. I think in New Zealand's case, the lags are somewhat less than in the US, but it's a valid technical question. But in a sense, that's a narrow technical point. The key point is to anchor public expectations around a low nominal inflation rate. And just to speak to expectations again, I think expectations are crucially important. If you clearly expect inflation to be 10%, you've got wages and prices adjusting to that expectation. If the central bank actually wants to deliver inflation of 2%, you inevitably get an increase in unemployment because real wages are going up. People are adjusting their wages in the expectation that prices will be 10% increasing. Real wages going up. Employers lay off staff, unemployment goes up and stays up until behavior starts adjusting to whatever the new inflation rate is. So getting those expectations right in labor markets particularly is crucially important in terms of reducing the social costs of maintaining a low inflation rate.
How do you think central bank governors in general should respond to public sentiment around a recession fear or economic growth in general? Suppose you were a governor of a country that had reasonably high inflation, either high single digits or even double digits, and you had to bring inflation down towards 2%, 0 to 2% even. And so you had to, in this case, raise the policy rate. The fear around that is that you would bring the recession into the economy, which would be a very unpopular policy. So, would you respond to the public pressure somehow, or would you continue on the path to bring inflation down?
Well, when the Reserve Bank Act 89 was put in place,
Yeah.
uh, the governor was personally accountable. In fact, when the law was being drafted, I expressed surprise that the inflation rate was to be agreed between the Minister of Finance and the government and the central bank governor in person. And I said, you mean surely it should be a contract with the Reserve Bank, the central bank? And the reply was, we can't fire the central bank. We can't even fire the board of the central bank, but we sure as hell can fire you. And the fact that it was a very personal accountability that I was going to lose my job, I didn't deliver, gave a certain degree of credibility to the fact we were dead keen on delivering it. And I think that changing the public expectation of what will happen to the inflation rate is a crucial part in reducing the social costs of getting the inflation rate down.
Okay. Well, on that note, what's your reaction or your thoughts on the Federal Reserve's habit of telegraphing their next move in their meeting minutes?
Well, I think there's some merit in that. I mean, we certainly ourselves, I think, may again have been the first central bank to publish forecasts of our policy rate on the basis of what we can see now. And the advantage of that was that by laying out quite explicitly the assumptions we were making in making that projection, as data became available, the market understood what it was likely to do to our policy rate in the future. So it was almost no hand central banking. It was quite extraordinary how the market anticipated every move we made. And it was partly because we were so explicit in making our assumptions about what was driving our forward track for the cash rate.
To what extent do central banks around the world coordinate their policies? So, for example, this month it's widely expected that the ECB, Bank of Canada, and perhaps later the Bank of England will be cutting rates, either by June or later this summer. Perhaps there's coordination, perhaps not. What's your take?
I don't, well, I can only speak from what my 14-year experience was. We didn't coordinate policy with other central banks at all, but clearly we were watching very carefully what they were doing because their policy has a bearing on us. By definition, a large country has a bearing on a small country. If the Fed changes its rate, it clearly will have an effect on the exchange rate and our exchange rate, if you're floating exchange rate at least. With the floating exchange as we had, that differential interest rate has a bearing on the exchange rate and therefore on the direct price effects arising from that exchange rate.
There is a belief now amongst some economists that currently in the US, fiscal dominance is more important for inflation than monetary policy, which is to say that fiscal policies have a more direct impact on the inflation rate than where the interest rate is. What's your take on this?
Uh, I don't have a strong view on that question. It's obviously a technical issue. And clearly, fiscal policy does have an effect on inflation. If you have a raging fiscal deficit, as the United States does at the moment, that's going to have an upward pressure on demand and therefore have inflationary consequences. The relative merits of those two, I don't want to comment on.
Would it be reasonable for, let's say, a central bank governor to speak with the finance minister and say, look, we're trying to fight inflation. We're trying to bring inflation down. Could you also work on bringing the deficit down, lowering the deficit? Would that be a reasonable conversation to have?
Well, the conversation, of course, that we had was not, I'm trying to get the inflation rate down. The conversation was, you have directed me to get inflation rate down. And I, of course, can do that. But if you're running an expansionary fiscal policy, it means that monetary policy has to be tighter than otherwise. So to some degree, you have an influence on monetary policy by your fiscal policy. And in fact, in the middle of the 1990s, the then Minister of Finance actually contacted us and said, quite publicly, we want to reduce taxes in 1996. Can we do that without prompting you to tighten monetary policy? It was quite a formal correspondence between the minister and the central bank because he had set the inflation rate. It wasn't our general view. It was his inflation target, which we were implementing.
Okay, let's talk now about some policies in New Zealand now regarding the economy. So you wrote an article about the higher trend, or the trend of higher prices, home prices in New Zealand. Its average home price to median income ratio is 6.6 in January 2024, which is down from 8.8 in January 2022. But this is still shy of the house price to income ratio of 3, which is considered affordable. You wrote an article about this called Perhaps the Most Important Speech from the New Government So Far. Summarize what you found for us, please, and what the policy should be to make housing more affordable in New Zealand.
Yeah, we have some very expensive housing in New Zealand. If you measure housing affordability, as you've just implied, by comparing the median household income in a city with the median house price in that same area, we've had very substantial inflation in house prices over a 30-year period, to the point where in the biggest city in New Zealand, namely Auckland, the median house price at one point got as high as about 10 to the median household income. A multiple of 10 is very high, about 3 times what it should be. And there are various causes for that, but the biggest single cause in the judgment of most experts, is the tight rationing of land. It is not so much house prices, but the land they sit on, which makes the house price expensive, the land house package expensive. And we have, as you know, a country which is slightly larger in area than the UK, a population of only 5 million. We're not short of land in New Zealand, but by tightly rationing the land where we can build houses, we've created the situation where lot prices or section prices, we call them in New Zealand, very high indeed. And that's just crazy. If you're lucky enough to be a single child in a two-parent family, you can hope to get a house. But if you're one of the two or three children and your family is not particularly wealthy, you have a real problem.
Does immigration play a factor in this? So, for example, net migration in 2023, I believe, was a record year for New Zealand. The country gained 173,000 immigrants, causing the population to rise by almost 3% that year. To what extent did that impact the house price?
Ironically, that very strong surge in immigration corresponded with some decline in house prices, and that some people find puzzling. But I mean, immigration clearly increases demand. It also, to some degree, increases supply, and it doesn't apparently push up the price of cars or many other things in New Zealand, all of which are responsive to increased demand. The problem in New Zealand is that the land market is not responsive to increased demand. We have artificially constrained the supply of land, which indeed you've done in some of the Canadian cities as well, of course.
Yes. Yes, of
Vancouver
course.
being a classic example.
Yeah, I live here. I know exactly what you mean. Yes.
Right, right. Okay.
Yeah, Vancouver is a special case. It'll be a case study for years to come. I'm curious as to how much the housing market would ultimately affect monetary policy. Presumably, if home prices are going up for the reasons that you've stated, it may cause inflation. It may cause monetary policy to become tighter, would it not?
Not directly. I mean, house prices are not in our consumer price index, not directly. Housing costs are, so that rents effectively are, so that rents are undoubtedly affected by house prices. To the extent that those feed into the CPI, then definitely it does affect the government's decision on monetary policy.
Biggest challenges facing the world today, if you could sum that up for us.
Well, inevitably, I'm talking from a New Zealand perspective, but for us, the two big issues are the geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. Many of your viewers will be familiar with the book by Graham Allison, which talks about the inevitable conflict between an established power, which clearly the United States is, and a rising power, which clearly China is. And that tension has been gradually growing in the last 10 years, particularly, and is now quite a difficult one for many countries, particularly in the Asian region. Most countries in Asia have their biggest single market in China, but many countries also have a close association with the United States. And that generates a lot of tension in the Asia Pacific region, at least.
Well, you mentioned to me offline that AUKUS, which is a trilateral security agreement between Australia, the UK, and the US, presents a challenge for New Zealand from a trading perspective. Can you elaborate more?
Yeah, and it's a deal by which Australia will buy 8 nuclear-powered submarines. They won't be delivered for quite some time. And many Australians say these are really not for defense of Australia. They're really for providing additional support to the United States in the South China Sea. For Australia, China is its largest trading partner. Indeed, that's true for many other countries in Asia. And there are lots of people in Australia who think this was a bad mistake by Australia. New Zealand is under pressure to join what's called Pillar 2 of the AUKUS deal. Pillar 1 involves the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines by Australia. Pillar 2 is said to be a deal involving no nuclear submarines, but nevertheless exchange of technology, etc. I think Canada too has been under some pressure to join so-called Pillar 2 of AUKUS, and it's seen as the large anti-China alliance in the Asian region, and that puts considerable tensions for a country like New Zealand.
So where does New Zealand stand on this issue?
Well, right now, New Zealand is divided on this issue. The government, or Minister of Finance, sorry, Minister of Foreign Affairs in New Zealand has made supportive remarks about joining AUKUS, but there are many people who think this would be a bad mistake. Interestingly, I'm currently involved with Helen Clark in quite a lot of opposition to AUKUS. Helen Clark was the Prime Minister of Australia, I'm sorry, Prime Minister of New Zealand from 1999 to 2008. I was leader of the opposition, as you mentioned in your intro, for part of that period. So we were political opponents, but we both agreed that joining AUKUS would be a bad mistake for New Zealand.
Well, what is your, I guess, general response to Graham Allison's assertion that a rising power is likely to face some sort of conflict or war with an existing power? Is this inevitable, or can this be avoided?
Well, as you will know, perhaps, Graham Allison looked in the last 500 years and found 16 cases where a rising power was challenged by, established power was challenged by a rising power. And in 12 of those 16 cases, war was the result. So clearly, war is not inevitable, but war is what, a probability, unless steps are taken, very conscious steps to avoid that situation. And that's clearly what the world desperately needs, both the United States and China clearly being nuclear armed countries. Any conflict between the two of them would be very serious indeed for both countries and indeed for other countries in the world.
Well, are they on their path towards some sort of conflict right now, as assuming nothing changes?
Well, I mean, right now, the United States wants to maintain military power right up to China's border. And in particular, is making it very clear that they will defend Taiwan if China decides that China decides if China decides to reincorporate Taiwan in China. And that is clearly an obvious flashpoint. South China Sea is the other obvious flashpoint, and there's some people say the East China Sea around Korea and Japan is another potential point of conflict. But to me, the insistence on the United States on projecting power to China's border makes some kind of conflict, if not inevitable, then quite likely.
Well, what can be done to avoid a kinetic war? I mean, they, like you said, they are major trading partners. They're too large. They represent two large economic blocs. Such a war would be catastrophic for all fronts.
I don't know the immediate answer to that question because clearly lots of other people are working on the issue. Uh, I personally think the United States has to accept that China has become a major power. China's economy will almost certainly be bigger than that of the United States very shortly, if it is not already bigger than the US economy. Purchasing power parity suggests that they are, in fact, bigger than the United States. Given the population is 4 times that of America, it seems to most people inevitable that at some point China's economy will become larger than the US. And inevitably, that generates tension with the United States.
Let's talk about Ukraine. So recently, last week, there was a pivot in policy prior to what happened a week ago. It was understood that the U.S. and its allies did not condone Ukraine striking into Russia with long-range missiles. That has reversed. The U.S. is now allowing Ukraine to do so, and in fact, is supplying them with long-range missiles, I believe, with a range of up to 500 kilometers. What is your reaction to this policy? Reversal that, by the way, is also supported by the U.S.'s allies, Britain, France, for example.
Yes, well, I mean, I just think Ukraine is an awful situation. And to my mind, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was made almost inevitable when the NATO allies decided to invite Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO in 2008. The US was warned at that time by the US ambassador in Moscow this would be an absolute red line for Russia. And Russia's been pushing on Ukraine pretty well ever since. Of course, not just in 2022, but also from 2014 on. It's been an issue which has been high on Moscow's agenda. So I think the US bears a lot of responsibility for this mess. And I look at the situation recently where, having provoked the Russians to attack Ukraine, then Congress decided not to supply more weapons for 6 months. I mean, an outrageous situation put the Ukrainians in a hell of a spot. By good fortune, if you like, the Americans finally did come to the party and provide weapons. But I mean, I'm very critical of US policy in Ukraine.
Right. I remember, or you might remember as well, when the invasion first happened, all over US media, the word unprovoked was used
Yeah, yeah,
many, many times. It was kind
yeah,
of the theme. How
yeah.
would you challenge that word?
Absolutely. As I say, it is simply not true to say Russia was not provoked. Um, I follow people like John Mearsheimer, Chicago University, or Jeffrey Sachs, I think he's at Princeton, point out that in 1991, when the Soviet Union basically collapsed, and East Germany and West Germany united, the US undertook that NATO would not expand to the east. A few years later, they incorporated Poland and so on, but later they incorporated some more countries. In 2008, they said, okay, let's have Ukraine and Georgia right on the border of Russia. As I think it was David Stockman, former Reagan official, pointed out, if you were surprised at Russia's reaction, don't forget how America reacted to the idea of having Russian Soviet troops in Cuba. And the analogy, in his view, was quite close.
I'm curious as to what, yes. Where do you think um, this war is ultimately headed?
I'm not sure, of course, but one way or the other, great powers, by which I mean any country which has got a lot of nukes, have to be given a degree of space, which is why I think Russia needs a bit of space, China needs a bit of space, and crowding up to their borders is just foolhardy.
Some people say that a negotiation is one way to resolve this conflict, to bring Mr. Putin and Western leaders to the negotiating table, some sort of deal, some sort of ceasefire. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And again, because there's a part of eastern Ukraine which is uh, Russian speaking, I would concede the fact that that part of Ukraine may have to go to Russia.
I like to bring up the counter argument to that, the critics of the negotiation diplomacy route, which is that they would say you shouldn't be negotiating with a quote unquote tyrant, referring to Vladimir Putin. You shouldn't be, he's not going to probably honor whatever negotiation or agreement has been reached, and appeasement has never worked in the history of mankind anyway. And so brute force is really the only way to force him to surrender.
Of course, to which I would say, the United States undertook NATO would not expand to the east either, but nevertheless has expanded NATO to the east steadily over 30 years.
Right.
Great
Uh,
powers like to push the boundary.
Ultimately, does geopolitical risk and conflict influence monetary policy directly? Let's take your time at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, for example, the Gulf War in the early 90s, the invasion of Kuwait. Did you look at these hotspots and say we should change monetary policy in any way?
The contract we had with the Minister of Finance, the contract I had with the Minister of Finance, explicitly provided for disregarding certain totally exogenous price influences, so that when the oil price jumped with the Gulf War, as you point out, that was regarded as a sort of exclusion from the index. Uh, Secondary effects of that price shock were to be incorporated in a policy objective, but the direct price effects were to be ignored.
Okay. Don, I really appreciate you educating us and giving us this history lesson. Very valuable indeed. Final question before I let you go. Was there a central bank governor of any central bank that I guess influenced you in any way personally or someone you looked up to?
Well, I came into central banking with no central banking background at all. I was a PhD in economics, but I was not a monetary policy expert. Uh, Charles Goodhart was clearly a major intellectual influence on the Reserve Bank framework. from the Bank of England, or from the UK at that point. He wasn't in the Bank of England at that point. He was in academia in the UK. He had a significant influence. Funnily enough, Paul Volcker had also visited New Zealand just prior to my becoming governor in 1988. So I was vaguely aware of the United States struggle with getting inflation under control. But I think if I had to nominate one person, it would be Charles Goodhart.
Very good. Anywhere we can learn more about you or follow your work today?
Two things. You mentioned my autobiography in 2014 called Incredible Luck. I'm also take part in a blog which is called Bassett, Brash and Hyde, Hide, which is sometimes I write on that. Others contribute too, of course, but that's the only thing I write on regularly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again. And thank you for
Thank you.
watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.